Hello again from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. Here is my summary of an interview that Sue Klebold, the mother of the younger boy who killed various people at Columbine High School or participated in the killing of a total of 13 people there before turning the gun on himself, or rather before turning the guns on themselves. Dylan Klebold gave to Psychology Today, apparently an online American psychology magazine. In March 2016, no copyright infringement intended, and I hope and pray that this video will do something to put the Columbine High School massacre in a broader perspective. For example, mental health, and then why not even spiritual health, although she doesn't really address that issue. She's not a professing Christian, while she has at least been a member of the Lutheran Church for many years. So, this was posted on March the 14th, 2016. I think that I already read this interview in 2 videos back in January 2019, but repetition is not always an evil action. Mark Goulston interviewed her after having read her book, partly an autobiography, partly a biography of her late son Dylan, A Mother's Reckoning, completely. Unlike many other interviewers, Dr. Goulston is also a psychiatrist with a specialty in trauma, trauma meaning like emotional, psychological pain after some awful event, suicide and violence prevention, and have trained FBI and police hostage negotiators. And he also claims to be a specialist in listening. So he had 3 basic questions which Sue Klebold was permitted by him to answer as broadly as she chose to, or in as limited way as she chose to. 1, tell me about Dylan. 2, as you think of the past, say what comes to your mind when you think, if only. And 3, as you think of the future and about lessening school shootings, murder/suicides, because the Columbine High School massacre was a murder-suicide. They murdered in cold blood, apparently, 13 people, 12 fellow students and 1 teacher who was also a sports coach at the school, and who actually, while he unfortunately bled to death that afternoon, the shootings had occurred before 12 noon, except for the perpetrator's double suicide shortly after 12 noon. David Sanders officially was instrumental in quickly evacuating the cafeteria and in leading and commanding those students who were on the hallways to get inside classrooms and to lock them. And unfortunately then he came across the killers, faced them on one of the hallways, turned around and tried to run to safety. I think he was with a student then. Unfortunately, he was hit fatally. And just plain suicides, say what comes to your mind when you think, what if? And then, according to Dr. Goulston, the interview took on a life of its own. So, Sue, I try not to repeat myself too much, of what I have done in earlier videos. What I have read out loud in the earlier interview videos, interview transcripts videos, where Mrs. Klebold speaks of him. Anyway, according to Mrs. Klebold, Dylan was, as a young child, precocious, that is more intelligent or more mature than his biological age would entitle a parent, in this case his mother, to think. Darling, lovable child. He was very bright. And since Mrs. Klebold had worked as a teacher and had a degree in, and still has a degree in education, she was really inspired to informally teach him at home. And Dylan was especially good at math. And then let's skip down. Dylan wanted to be self-reliant, so he was more of a self-learner, as indeed he acknowledged in a brief video featuring him, filmed at Columbine High School during that fateful school year, which he and his friend Dylan Klebold and 12 of their fellow students and one teacher would never complete because of this murder-suicide school shooting. So according to Mrs. Klebold, Dylan's need to figure things out by himself, to help himself, not to have to ask help from anyone. In other words, his need to be self-reliant also contributed to his death, because I think it was just loathsome, so deeply detestable and deeply hateful to him to have to think about getting help from somebody. So he wanted to be able to handle everything himself, and unfortunately, Sue and her longtime husband, Tom, who eventually got divorced, maybe partly because Sue wanted to speak out about the Columbine tragedy, while Tom wanted to avoid all media publicity. They were so used to his handling things himself and so dependent on his doing things right and doing things well, that when he really did begin to unravel, she didn't think that they had any idea what was happening to him. And because Dylan was not a son who wanted to share his feelings either with his mother or with his father or his older brother, who by the time of the Columbine high school massacre had already left the Klebold family house. They could not even conceive of the kind of pain that he was in and didn't think to look for it. So we'll skip over. Yes. So as he reached adolescence and got out of the gifted students program, junior high school started. And he was still, according to his mother, excruciatingly painfully shy. And it was a big issue for him if his mother called out his name, as indeed she did. She was trying to pick him up after school and yelled out his name out the window. And as soon as Dylan boarded the car, he said, "Mom, don't ever say my name in front of everybody." And according to his mother, who has worked with students of special needs, handicapped students, and who really has tried during the 2 decades that have passed since those unfortunate shootings to understand on a more profound psychological level what might have gone on inside her self-killed, suicidal younger son's mind. According to his mother, Dylan did not really have the ability to laugh at himself or to lighten up. And he took things very seriously, although he was also playful and liked to do things with the family, and he liked different kinds of foods. Then Dr. Goulston addressed the issue of Dylan Klebold's height. He stated that he was 6 feet 4 inches, actually, according to the autopsy report, which can be found on Google. I don't remember the website, but I think I looked at it back in January or then in 2018. Dylan Klebold was actually measured to be 6 feet 3.5 inches tall. Interestingly enough, his fellow perpetrator and the one who possibly or probably persuaded him, maybe in the name of friendship and in the name of their mutual dislike of life, as usual, things as usual, Derek Harris was only 5 feet 8.5 inches tall. So let's see now, 7 inches shorter. Remarkable height difference. So according to his mother anyway, all the way through school, Dylan was a year younger than everybody in his class. In other words, he had started school a year early, it seems, or then he had skipped a grade. And was always, if not the tallest, probably the second tallest. And well, one might think that having a superior height would have boosted his self-confidence, but actually, according to Mrs. Klebold, it didn't. But rather, it made him feel painful. And Goulston then said, and plus, if you're tall, you're not allowed to get angry because people will think you're a big, and so you have all this stuff going on in your head. Well, and I would add, probably people somehow think that because you are taller than your peers, you also should be somehow more mature, or at least try to act in a more adult-like way. And Sue Klebold herself, growing up, was tall for her age, apparently. In junior high, Dylan's grades began to slip, and his parents, especially Sue, became concerned. And then some people, maybe teachers, had asked him, do you want to go to the high school for algebra? A subject of which, according to Sue Klebold, Dylan was terrified. He said, no, I don't want to do that. So we said, okay, well, hang out there in junior high and take geometry, take other classes. And he just didn't want to be the focus of attention. So it was uncomfortable. So Dr. Goulston considered it possible, or asked, do you think there was a point where he almost hated being smarter than other people because it wasn't helping him to be happier? According to Mrs. Klebold, that probably was true. And then in junior high school, when his grades started to slide downward, and his parents were asking, what's going on? You did such a great job in elementary school. Why don't you want to keep it up? He said, it's not cool to be smart. Well, I mean, that's probably a universal problem, regardless of the country where you are in, regardless of the continent where you are in, regardless of the majority religion, regardless of the socioeconomic context. There always will be some students who bully those who are serious about studying, who want to get high grades and maintain them, because they want to get well-paying occupations, and occupations where they can make a difference, socially and otherwise. And then, of course, students on the other hand, who may be trying, but because they are special learners, slow learners, they struggle to even pass their subjects. So they can also get bullied. So it goes both ways. So that is probably one of the reasons why some students are afraid of trying hard, because they are afraid of being picked on by their peers, or at least those of their peers whom they consider or would like to be their friends. Again, we have to skip a lot of lines. Yes. So 1998 was a rather crucial year in the brief lifespans of Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. In January or February, well, in January 1998, Eric Harris had on his own website posted a death threat mentioning one classmate who had actually sometimes been his friend and would eventually reconcile with him before April 1999, Brooks Brown. So Eric basically had boastfully and in a sick way written, "I don't care if I die. All I want to do is to kill as many of you," expletive deleted, "as possible, especially some people like Brooks Brown." The Brown parents were smart enough and concerned enough to file a report about this online threat, death threat, against their son in one of the local police stations. And actually, a police officer did write an affidavit which would have given that police station the authority to investigate the case. Unfortunately, for some reason or reasons, no one took action. No superior officer took action. If they had taken action, possibly this massacre could have been prevented. And then there was this evening when Dylan and Eric gave into the temptation to steal. They stole some electronic equipment from the back of a truck, and Eric then boastfully, in his expletive filled and psychopathic journal, which can be accessed through Googling for those who want to find it, basically justified the theft by the fact that the United States is the land of the free. In other words, he claimed that Americans had the freedom to steal if their fellow Americans or fellow residents of the United States, in his opinion, in a stupid way, left such equipment in the back of their trucks or vans, in this case van, supposedly out in the middle of nowhere. Of course, that was an exaggeration. And then Dylan hacked into the school's computer system because he had been entrusted by one or more teachers with the responsibility for monitoring it, and especially the lockers, because each locker has a different serial number and a different number code to be opened. And then he scrawled on that locker a threatening message to the boyfriend of a girl who had been his brief love interest. And as his mother in this interview pointed out, it was such a silly boy thing. So such a silly, boyish, immature action. And in her opinion, the school authorities were too harsh in disciplining her son by suspending him. Well, in retrospect, possibly, if instead the principal and then one or two more teachers, the school psychologist, if there was an official like that at the school, or maybe even the school nurse, the school social worker, had taken time to encourage him to open up about his feelings and then admit if he had had a crush, like confidentially, of course, if he had had a crush on this girl, and then ask him if he ever thought about how his threat, even if it wasn't to be taken seriously, felt in the mind of the boy who read it. And did he really so simplistically think that just because that boy had, in quotes, stolen his potential girlfriend, he couldn't be happy, that he couldn't find another girl, either at Columbine High School or somewhere else? Because, well, I mean, he had this hunger for love. Unfortunately, he tried to satisfy it or then dull it the wrong way. He started to love these violent video games, not the least of which was Doom, where Eric had excelled, and probably he also had excelled. And then he started to love videos and films about killing people, stories about killing people. If those English teachers and video course teachers who had to read and view their violence-filled schoolwork, essays, and videos, if they had been discerning enough that these boys were in serious trouble emotionally, and if they had been born-again Christians and discerning enough at that they would above all have needed spiritual help, maybe this massacre could have been prevented. Of course, we can't say for sure, because at least one of the boys could have hardened and refused all help anyway. But maybe. These are my assumptions. And even Mrs. Klebold said to Dylan that, in her opinion, it was an overreaction to suspend him from school, albeit for a few days only, for making that threat. Let's see now. Mrs. Klebold was at some point in 1998 sufficiently concerned about her son to even ask, "I don't know, Dylan, do you think you need counseling?" And he replied, "No, I don't think I do." And he continued, "I will prove to you that I don't need counseling. I'll prove it to you." So, like, superficially, he started to focus more on his studies. His grades started to improve again. He applied to 3 universities and was accepted, and he actually visited one of them. But then he had this secret double life with his psychopathic friend, Eric Harris. And because he did not have a wide circle of friends, maybe he felt that if he broke with Eric somehow, this would worsen his reputation in the eyes of his peers. So even though he tried to be self-reliant, friendships and other relationships were actually particularly important for him, like they are for most teenagers and even for many adults. Then one of the experts to whom Mrs. Klebold talked before the shootings said if he just had a girlfriend, he would probably have been okay and would have gotten past this. However, he had an unrequited love. Maybe he was dreaming of a girl who was too ideal. Or, I mean, he just didn't have the courage to approach this girl, assuming that she actually existed and even was studying either at Columbine High School or anyway was living somewhere near him. Anyway, Mrs. Klebold saw during this interview a stark difference between Dylan's writings, that Dylan hungered for love, while Eric's writings, his private journals, were filled with madness and clearly showed him to be a very sick person. And the doctor also seemed to agree that one of the reasons why Dylan went along with Eric's murderous plan concerning the Columbine High School massacre was that he had this unfulfilled need to feel that he was loved. But even though his parents certainly loved him and cared for him, he did not feel loved. And then a statement which some of the journalists covering the publication of or reviewing the autobiographical/biographical book, A Mother's Reckoning, which Mrs. Klebold wrote, and then possibly even some of the survivors, and especially their parents, might have thought of as somehow claiming that Dylan wasn't fully to blame for his part in the massacre, but of course this was not what Mrs. Klebold said or felt. If only the school system had been more sensitive to my son's needs and not tried to plug it into a punishment for behavior that might have been indicative that he needed help. If only they had a better handle on a toxic school culture. If only they had procedures in place when they saw Dylan's violent paper to examine whether or not he was troubled or whether this was just something that he wrote. If only when he'd had his doctor's appointment for a sore throat a couple of months before this happened. If only the doctor had done a psychological screening of somehow to say, hey, you've got some serious issues going on here besides throat. If only when he was in diversion, the whole diversion program was different. If only knowing that a child who had never gotten into trouble was suddenly in trouble, and what a difficult, humiliating thing that was for him inside. If only they had been alert to the fact that he was at an elevated suicide risk and known how to advise me how to handle that and how to help him. I don't know, I mean, it just goes on, it's like these little circles. Then something else. To me, telling a story is a process of desensitization. It lowers the pain level until finally you've heard the story enough, you've experienced enough, talked about it enough that it ceases to hurt so much. And so yes, telling this story to me is an important part of healing from trauma and loss. Then Mrs. Klebold goes on. I think that suicide prevention, education, and awareness should be part of every curriculum where you work with people. It should be part of educators' curricula. People in healthcare should have that. I know in our own state, meaning Colorado, Rocky Mountains state in Western United States, we were trying to get this law to try to require counselors and psychiatrists to have at least a certain amount of suicide prevention training. And we can't even get that passed here, meaning through the state legislature, apparently, even though we are in the top 10 on the suicide rates. And it's because of the system that we have here. It's very autonomous, in other words, self-governing. And the professionals don't want to be told what they should be learning. So these are the kind of things that concern me that we have to start. Any final thoughts? Asked Dr. Goulston. Sue Klebold. If you are a parent reading this, I have one request. If you have a moody child of any age, or maybe early teens or older, I would like you to go to that child and say, what is something that nobody in the world understands about you that causes you fear, pain, or anger? And then whatever they say, let them finish and then say to them, tell me more, and then just listen. Don't rush in to give them advice when what they need is comfort. Also realize that if you think your child is in a dark place, and even if they push back, you don't need their permission to find out where they are and do everything you can to get them out. Do it for them, do it for yourselves, and do it for me, because I only wish I had. Yes. So that's the video. And let's keep praying for those of us who believe in prayer, believe that God also answers prayer. Let's keep praying for these troubled people, all the way from toddlers to elderly people who are in danger of harming themselves and or others, and who, above all, lack that God-given hope for future and eternal life. God bless you all and have a wonderful, happy, blessed, and positively memorable Easter.